The barren moon of Charx was a desolate wasteland. Once a thriving planet teeming with life, it had been reduced to a graveyard of abandoned outposts and wreckage. Jagged cliffs, jagged as the scars left by war, stretched under an unyielding gray sky. In this forsaken place, survival was a cruel joke. At the edge of a sheer cliffside, a massive, wolf-like creature lay sprawled on the cold, rocky ground. Her name was Shara, a Korian Direwolf, a creature genetically engineered by the Galactic League for one purpose: war. With her towering frame, sleek silver fur, and glowing violet eyes, she had once been a symbol of fear. But now, she was little more than a shadow of her former self, abandoned by the very beings who had bred her. And she wasn't alone. Two tiny cubs huddled at her side, their small bodies trembling against the fierce winds that whipped through the desolate landscape. These helpless pups, barely old enough to stand, were all she had left. And the wolves were dying, slowly, painfully, under the crushing weight of abandonment. Her howl pierced the empty sky, a haunting sound of desperation. The cubs whimpered in response, their innocent cries blending with the cold wind. She could feel her strength fading with each passing moment. Without food or shelter, there was no way they could survive. If help didn't come soon, this would be their grave. Meanwhile, Sergeant Joey Avery, a battle-hardened soldier stationed at a remote outpost on Charx, sat in front of his scanner, scanning the rocky terrain for signs of life. His mission was simple: monitor, report, and survive. JX was his last assignment before finally returning to Earth, and he couldn't wait for it to be over. His days were filled with static, endless scans and long, quiet shifts. He was all too familiar with the dull hum of loneliness. But today, something unusual flickered on his radar. A faint pulse, a life sign. Curious, John adjusted the scanner, eyes narrowing. There was no mistaking it, something alive out there in the wasteland. His curiosity piqued. He grabbed his gear and set off into the rocky expanse. As he neared the source, he moved cautiously, crouching behind a boulder. Through the dim light of JX's twin moons, he saw them. A massive wolf-like creature, her once pristine fur matted and covered in dirt. She was hunched low, her ribs clearly visible, her eyes dull with exhaustion. At her side, two small cubs huddled together, barely able to stand, their trembling bodies seeking warmth. Joey's heart sank as he realized what he was looking at. A Korian Direwolf. The same breed he'd read about in his training reports. Ferocious, intelligent, and bred for one thing: combat. But this creature, this mother, was nothing like the warrior he'd imagined. She was a casualty of the League's cold, calculated experiments, abandoned to die, left to rot on this forgotten moon. He stepped forward, making his presence known, but moving slowly, deliberately. Shara lifted her head at the sound, her body tensing. She growled weakly, positioning herself protectively in front of her cubs. It was a weak, desperate sound, one that spoke of survival, not aggression. "Easy there," Joey murmured, lowering his posture to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you." He pulled a canteen of water from his pack and set it on the ground, stepping back several paces. Shara eyed him warily, her sharp violet gaze never leaving him. Then, slowly, she inched forward, her instincts kicking in. With a cautious sniff, she nudged the canteen with her nose, drinking tentatively before pulling back. Her cubs followed suit, unsure but desperate. Joey watched them with a mixture of awe and sadness. These creatures were bred for war, designed to be ruthless. But now, they were just survivors. Shara was a mother fighting to keep her cubs alive against impossible odds. The next day, Joey returned. It was against every protocol he'd been given. He wasn't supposed to get involved with the creatures on this planet, let alone assist one in need. But he couldn't ignore the pull in his chest. He packed a bag with whatever he could scrounge from the outpost: ration bars, a second canteen, a few thermal blankets. With each step toward the wolf's den, Joey steeled himself. He had no idea what Shara would do. She could tear him to pieces if she wanted. But he couldn't leave them behind. When he arrived, Shara was still there, her eyes flicking to him as he approached. Her body had softened, though her instinctual wariness remained. The cubs were closer now, their curiosity piqued. Joey moved slowly, cautiously, and set the supplies on the ground. He backed away, giving them space. He unwrapped a ration bar and tossed a small piece a few feet away. One of the cubs, a ball of soft fur with bright eyes, edged forward, sniffing the air. The scent of food lured it in. Hesitantly, the cub took a bite, followed quickly by the second. They ate ravenously, their hunger overpowering any fear they might have had. Shara watched them, her gaze shifting between Joey and her cubs. When Joey offered a second piece, she hesitated for only a moment before lowering her head, sniffing the food, and finally accepting it. Joey watched her, his heart tightening. She was no longer the war machine the League had crafted. She was a mother, just like him, fighting to keep her family alive. Days turned into weeks, and Joey's visits became routine. Every day he brought food and supplies. Every day, Shara grew a little less wary, a little more trusting. The cubs, too, began to grow bolder. They came closer, sniffing his hand, and one day, they even allowed him to touch them. They weren't afraid anymore. They weren't alone anymore. Joey knew that his actions would have consequences. He was a soldier, bound by duty and protocol. But this was something different. These weren't just beasts. They were lives that mattered. And he couldn't abandon them. As the days passed, Joey found himself thinking more and more about the Korian Direwolf family. His mission had changed. No longer was it about following orders and scanning the terrain. Now his mission was to save them. He couldn't let them die here, abandoned in the cold expanse of Charx. But Shara wasn't just a weapon. She was a mother. And Joey Avery wasn't just a soldier. He was a human being who saw the fight for survival in her eyes. And he wasn't about to let it go unanswered. The winds of Charx howled like ancient ghosts, carrying with them the bitter scent of dust and decay. The jagged cliffs that loomed over the wolf's den cast long shadows, stretching across the barren landscape as the twin moons rose high into the starless sky. Sergeant Joey Avery sat on a flat rock just beyond the den, his eyes focused on the small family of Korian Direwolves. Shara, once a towering figure bred for war, now seemed more like a shadow of her former self, her once sleek silver fur matted and worn, her body lean with hunger. Yet in her eyes, Joey saw something he hadn't expected: hope. The mother wolf was fighting, not just for her own survival, but for her cubs, who had grown stronger and more curious with each passing day. Star and Shadow, the cubs, had become bolder, their initial fear of Joey slowly turning into trust. Every day, they ventured a little closer, their bright eyes watching him as they sniffed at his gear, pawed at his boots, and occasionally nudged his hands for scraps of food. They were still wild, too wild to be fully tamed, but Joey could see the bond forming. It was fragile, a delicate thread between them, but it was there. Joey exhaled a long breath and glanced at the horizon. His mission on Charx had been clear from the start: monitor the area, report any signs of life, and maintain a quiet, unobtrusive presence. Yet, now he found himself caught in a war he hadn't signed up for. This wasn't about duty or protocol anymore. It was about doing what he knew was right. He glanced down at the thermal blanket he'd spread on the ground next to him. Shara lay on it, curled protectively around her cubs, her eyes trained on him, as if she understood that he had become a part of their fragile world. The wind whipped around them, but for the first time in weeks, Joey felt a sense of calm. His thoughts were interrupted by a low beep from his communication device. "Great," he muttered under his breath. He picked up the device, checking the new transmission. A message from his superior, Captain Reese, flashed on the screen. "Avery, we've detected an anomaly in the region. Return to base immediately for new orders. Do not engage with local life forms. I repeat, do not engage." Joey's stomach churned. He knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't about an anomaly. It was about him. They'd noticed his deviation from protocol. The food, the supplies, his visits to the wolf den. They weren't stupid. They were watching him, and they wouldn't let this slip under the radar. His fingers tightened around the device. The League didn't care about the creatures here. They had no value. No tactical purpose. To them, Shara and her cubs were just tools. They were weapons, nothing more. And weapons could be discarded when they no longer served a purpose. Joey's heart raced. His duty had always been clear. Follow orders, protect the interests of the League, and maintain control of the region. But he couldn't, in good conscience, walk away from the wolves. He'd seen them struggle, fight, and grow, just like any family would. He couldn't leave them to die alone in this wasteland. He looked over at the wolves one last time. Shara was awake, her violet eyes narrowing, as if she sensed his turmoil. She nudged her cubs, who had fallen asleep beside her, and slowly rose to her feet. Her movements were stiff, but she was trying. Trying for them. Trying for her family. Joey stood, pocketing the device, his mind racing. He had no time to waste. If the League was sending reinforcements, he had to act fast. "Stay here," Joey whispered to Shara, though he knew she couldn't understand him. But there was something in her eyes that spoke volumes. She knew he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a part of their fight. The following morning, Joey's decision was made. He had two choices: follow orders, return to base, and report everything as it was, or defy his superiors, disobey protocol, and try to get Shara and her cubs to safety. The consequences of the second option were clear. He'd be court-martialed, imprisoned, maybe even worse. But there was no question in his mind. He couldn't leave them behind. Packing his gear, Joey took one last look at the outpost, a silent, cold structure that would be his last connection to Earth if he followed through. But he wasn't going back. Not today. His pack was lighter than usual, the weight of it feeling almost insignificant compared to the weight of the decision he was about to make. He trekked across the rocky expanse toward the wolves' den, his heart pounding with each step. He could feel the tension in the air, the gravity of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. Every step brought him closer to the wolves and closer to the point of no return. As he reached the familiar outcrop where Shara and her cubs had made their home, Joey paused. He set his pack on the ground, scanning the horizon. The twin moons were low, casting long shadows over the landscape, and the silence was almost suffocating. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the canyons. Then he heard it, a low rumble, a growl. Joey's body tensed. Shara was standing, her body rigid, her eyes locked on something in the distance. Her hackles were raised, and her cubs were pressed close to her, their small bodies trembling. Joey's heart sank as he followed her gaze. In the distance, a pair of sleek, black craft cut through the sky, their engines cutting through the wind like a buzz saw. Flying saucers, the unmistakable symbols of the Galactic League's enforcement division. They were coming, and they were coming for him. "Stay close," Joey murmured to Shara, his voice barely a whisper. He moved closer to the mother wolf, who, for the first time, did not growl at him. Instead, she stood protectively in front of her cubs, watching the approaching ships with the same defiance Joey felt in his bones. The craft were getting closer. Joey could feel the heat rising in his chest. He had no choice now. He'd made his stand. The League would come for him, but they would not take Shara or her cubs. The wolves wouldn't die on Charx, not while he had anything to say about it. Joey turned back to Shara, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We're leaving this moon, whether they like it or not." As the first of the League's ships touched down in the distance, Joey Avery made a vow. He wouldn't let the wolves die like this, abandoned and forgotten. Whatever it took, he would protect them. The hum of the League's craft grew louder as Joey crouched beside Shara, his heart hammering in his chest. The Korian Direwolf's violet eyes locked with his, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They weren't just two beings caught in a desolate landscape. They were two souls, united by necessity and, perhaps, something deeper. The ships descended quickly, their sleek black forms cutting through the air like predators hunting prey. Joey's mind raced as he weighed his options. There was no running. He couldn't leave Shara and her cubs. His mission had been to monitor the area, not to engage. But that was before he had seen the wolves fight for survival. This wasn't about orders anymore. This was about standing for something when the entire galaxy seemed bent on disregarding life. "All right, girl," Joey whispered to Shara, his voice a mixture of resolve and caution. "We got one shot at this." Shara's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, her gaze steady. Her low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound that vibrated in the air as if daring the ships to come closer. She would fight. She would protect her cubs, and Joey would stand beside her. Joey didn't have time to plan anything elaborate. There was no strategy, no backup, no reinforcements. Just him, a soldier with nothing more than his wits, his gear, and a newfound bond with a mother wolf and her cubs. He stood up slowly, moving toward the ridge overlooking the barren valley. The ships had landed now, their black hulls standing out against the dusty surface of Charx. Figures began to emerge. Humanoid, clad in black armor with glowing visors. The Galactic League's enforcement squad was here. Joey could see the insignia on their chest plates, and his stomach churned. They were his people. Or, at least they had been once. The faces behind the visors didn't matter. It was the orders they would follow that terrified him. "Captain Reese isn't going to like this," Joey muttered, reaching for the rifle strapped to his back. He turned back to Shara. "Stay close and stay low. We're not going down without a fight." Shara, already positioned in front of her cubs, stood tall. Her gaze was fierce, protective, and unwavering. She was ready. The first of the armored soldiers, a towering figure, stepped forward, raising his weapon. Joey's eyes narrowed. He had a clear shot, but he wasn't sure if he could take them all on. His best bet was to stall them. Buy time. Make them question whether he was worth the trouble. "Step away from the animals," the soldier called, his voice amplified by his helmet speaker. "This is a restricted zone. Return to base immediately." Joey held his ground. "You're not taking them." His voice was steady, the kind of calm that comes before the storm. "They've been abandoned. Left to die. I'm not leaving them here to rot." The soldier's helmet turned, his head tilting slightly, as if surprised by Joey's defiance. "You have no authority here, Avery," the soldier said. "This is an order from the top. Stand down, or we will use force." Joey could hear the sound of the other soldiers behind him, their boots crunching against the rocky surface. They were closing in, a wall of armor and weaponry, but Joey wasn't backing down. He could feel the weight of his rifle against his back, but he hesitated. He'd been a soldier all his life. He understood tactics, strategy, combat, but he also knew what it meant to have something worth fighting for. This wasn't just about following orders. It was about choosing a side, and Joey had chosen. Before the soldiers could advance any further, Shara let out a deafening roar, a sound so primal that it rattled Joey's bones. Her powerful legs propelled her forward, the ground shaking beneath her as she lunged at the nearest soldier with terrifying speed. Her fangs bared. She knocked him to the ground, her strength and ferocity undeniable. The cubs, sensing the change, dashed toward their mother's side, their instincts guiding them. Joey took the opening. He dove for cover, rolling behind a large boulder as the first shots rang out. The soldiers opened fire, their weapons spitting plasma bolts at him. But he was already moving, his rifle raised in a swift, practiced motion. His first shot hit its mark, sending one soldier sprawling. Another one fell seconds later as Joey took another calculated shot. His heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The soldiers were relentless, but so was he. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. In the distance, Shara was locked in a brutal fight with two soldiers. Her movements were fierce, wild, and filled with the desperation of a mother protecting her young. One soldier tried to flank her, but she whipped around, knocking him away with a powerful swipe of her paw. The cubs were by her side, darting in and out, growing bolder with each passing second, as if feeding off their mother's strength. Joey's mind raced. He had to end this before it escalated further. With another glance at the approaching soldiers, Joey knew his time was running out. He didn't have the firepower to take them all down, but he did have something else. With a determined grunt, Joey sprinted forward toward the edge of the rocky outcrop. He reached the small supply cache he had hidden earlier, a few thermal explosives scavenged from the remains of an old Korian ship. His hands moved with urgency, quickly setting the devices on the rocky pillars that overlooked the battlefield. The soldiers were advancing. Joey set the timer and ran. "Shara, Get down! Joey shouted, his voice raw with urgency. Shara turned her head at the sound of his voice, her violet eyes locking onto his. She growled, instinctively pulling her cubs back toward the den. She didn't fully understand the danger, but she trusted him. Joey dove behind the same boulder, bracing himself as the timer ticked down. The soldiers were too close now, their weapons trained on him, unaware of the trap he had set. The explosion was deafening. A massive shockwave rippled through the valley, sending rocks and debris flying. The ground trembled as the thermal explosives triggered, setting off a chain reaction that engulfed the soldiers in a deadly blaze of fire and smoke. Joey's heart raced as he pushed himself up, eyes scanning the smoke-filled battlefield. He couldn't see the soldiers, couldn't hear them over the ringing in his ears. But he didn't have time to check. He moved fast, heading back toward Shara. The wolf and her cubs were huddled near the den, safe for now. Joey didn't stop. He grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder. We're moving out. Now! As the smoke began to clear, Joey knew this was only the beginning. The League would send more. They would come with more force. But Joey wasn't backing down. He'd made his choice. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would fight for the wolves, for the family he had vowed to protect. Joey looked down at Shara, her violet eyes full of an unspoken bond. The mission had changed. It was no longer about survival. It was about defiance. And the fight was only just beginning. The winds on Charx howled louder than ever, carrying the scent of scorched earth and destruction through the barren plains. Joey could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him as he crouched beside Shara. Her two cubs nestled protectively beneath her. The fight had left him breathless, but he knew it was far from over. The explosion had bought them a brief respite, but it wouldn't take long for the Galactic League to regroup. And when they did, there would be no second chances. Joey pulled a thermal blanket from his pack and draped it over the cubs, their small bodies trembling from the cold. Shara's eyes met his again, a steady gaze that spoke more than words could convey. Trust, hope, and perhaps a flicker of gratitude. Joey's mind raced as he stared at the horizon, the dim light of the twin moons casting eerie shadows over the wreckage. He had no illusions. The League wasn't just going to let this go. They would be back in force, and this time they would bring everything they had. He couldn't save Shara and her cubs alone. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, battered communicator. It was a relic from the early days of his training, something he'd carried with him just in case he needed to send out an emergency distress signal. The device hadn't been used in years. He hadn't planned to ever use it again. But now, staring down the barrel of certain death, Joey realized it was his only hope. Joey. The voice crackled through the speaker, a familiar, gruff tone that sent a cold shiver down his spine. You've got one chance to explain yourself. And that's it. We're sending a retrieval team for you. It's over. It was Captain Reese, his superior. Joey had served under him for years, and yet in that moment, he knew the captain wouldn't hesitate to leave him behind if it meant keeping the mission intact. Joey clenched his fists, the weight of his choices pressing on his chest. I'm not asking for a rescue, Joey muttered into the device. I'm asking for help. The communicator crackled, and for a moment, there was only static. Joey's heart skipped a beat, but then the voice came through again. Help? With what? Exactly? You've gone rogue, Avery. This is a mess you've gotten yourself into. You have no backup, no support. The League is not going to care about some wolf and her cubs. Their assets, weapons. Nothing more? Joey's grip tightened around the communicator. He glanced at Shara, her tired eyes watching him closely. There was no turning back now. They're not weapons, Joey said, his voice firm. They're living beings, and I'm not going to leave them to die. You may see them as tools, but I see them as something more. You want me to abandon them? Then you'll have to kill me first. Silence. For a moment, Joey thought he had lost the connection, or worse, that Reese had already written him off. But then, the crackling voice returned, quieter now, almost reluctant. Fine, I'll send a transport, but you're on your own after that. You'll be court-martialed. You understand that, right? Joey smiled grimly, staring out into the smoke-filled horizon. Understood? The hours dragged by like days. Joey kept low, his rifle at the ready, watching for any signs of movement. The night air grew colder, but he remained steadfast, his mind set on one goal: survival. He couldn't afford to think about what would happen next. Not yet. The distant roar of engines pierced the stillness of the night. Joey's heart leapt in his chest. The transport was here. They weren't alone anymore. Shara, sensing the change, lifted her head, her violet eyes narrowing as the ship's engines grew louder. Joey knew she could feel the tension in the air, just as he did. This was it, the final stand. The transport appeared in the distance, a massive craft descending with its engines roaring, kicking up dust and debris in the process. Joey's pulse quickened. The ship landed with a thud, its ramp lowering to reveal a small squad of soldiers clad in dark armor, their weapons drawn and aimed. Joey stood tall, his chest heaving, and took a deep breath. This was it. There would be no turning back now. As the soldiers stepped forward, Joey raised his hands, signaling his surrender. "I'm coming with you," he called out. "But I'm not leaving without them." The soldiers hesitated, glancing at each other, clearly confused by Joey's bold demand. They had orders to bring him back, alive or dead. But this was something they hadn't been prepared for. "Step aside, Avery," one of the soldiers growled. "We don't have time for this." But Joey didn't step aside. He stood firm, his rifle slung over his shoulder, but his hand resting close to it. Shara was behind him, her growls low but steady, her cubs huddled at her side. The soldier's eyes flickered toward her, the realization dawning that Joey was serious. That these creatures, these weapons, meant something to him. "These wolves aren't your property," Joey said, his voice steady but fierce. "They're not your tools, not your experiments. You abandoned them. I'm giving them a chance to live. I'm not going back without them." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant howls of the wind across the barren plain. The soldiers stood motionless, their weapons still aimed at Joey, but something in the way they looked at him had changed. Maybe they were seeing him for the first time, not as a soldier, but as a man who had defied orders for the sake of something greater. One of the soldiers, a young woman with an unreadable expression, lowered her weapon. "Captain Reese might not like it," she said quietly, glancing at her squad leader. "But I think he'll understand." Joey's heart skipped. For the first time in days, he felt hope stirring in his chest. Shara, sensing the shift, stepped forward, her massive form blocking Joey from the soldiers. Her growl was softer now, a quiet warning, but there was no fear in her eyes. She wasn't just defending her cubs. She was protecting Joey as well. The soldier who had spoken stepped forward, her voice surprisingly gentle. "We'll get you out of here, but you'll have to explain this mess when we're back." "All of it," Joey nodded, a small, grateful smile crossing his face. "I'll take the consequences, but at least I'll have a chance to survive." The cubs, sensing the change in the air, slowly approached the soldiers, their small bodies trembling but curious. Joey watched them, the weight of his decision finally sinking in. It had cost him his career, his future, but in the end, he had saved a family. With one last glance at Shara, Joey stepped forward, knowing the path ahead would be uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid.